Welcome, everybody. I hope everybody can hear well. If you have any questions, please put it on the chat and we'll try and help you. Towards the end, we will have a 20-minute for question answer. And for that, if you can put your question answer on the Q&A section, that would be really helpful. And also, if you're having issues joining via Zoom, we have a YouTube link which is the same live stream, so you can join there. If you want that link, let us know. So we will begin shortly. It'll be PowerPoint slides and then Alan speaking. So we'll go back and forth. And okay, we will. We can't hear you, Alan. We can't hear you, I think.
Is this better?
Yes.
And now I will. So, all is well, I presume? So welcome everyone to this talk, which I've entitled A Key to Mental Resilience. And I suggest that the key is, in fact, a meaningful life. So it would be easy to point to some particular meditative technique or exercise or diet or interpersonal relationships, and all of those can be useful. But from the research I've done, specifically in preparation for this talk, I think the most important key is, in fact, the cultivation of a meaningful life. And that's not a technique. We will dig deep and ask, what does it mean to lead a meaningful life? So let's look at the first slide. Thank you. And then the next slide, there we go. So I'd like to start with a very mundane point, simply the word resilience itself. I think it's a very interesting word, it's a useful word. And it's used for both materials like metals and so forth, and of course, in terms of personality and mind and so forth. So just to read it, what is the meaning of resilience? Here, there's this nice term in English, and it is the dictionary definition that the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions and to, quote, spring back into shape. That is to restore one's equilibrium and elasticity. It's a nice definition, isn't it? And so we see how this applies to physical substances, such as metals, in which physical resilience is closely related to one's immune system and vitality. So physical resilience, our immune system, our bodies, our ability to ward off infection, or if we get the infection, not become seriously ill, and so on. So that's a resilience, has to do with the immune system and diet, exercise, and so on. So there's resilience for metals, such that if they are put under stress, they're resilient, they don't snap, but they bend with the pressure. And likewise, when we're exposed to viruses or any other type of physical challenge, that we are resilient, we don't break, we don't succumb, we don't shatter. And then when it comes to mental resilience, this is closely related to the degree of one's mental balance. And then crucially, for the whole central topic of this talk, the degree of meaning in one's life. Now, meaning not as something that is judged objectively, but, and how would you do that? How quantitative can we get when it comes to leading a meaningful life? But rather subjectively, in terms of how meaningful we feel our lives are. So I was very inspired to turn to this particular topic of meaning by reading one of the great classics of English literature, Man in Search of Meaning, by the neurologist, the Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl. So if we can go to the next slide. So what is the first point to recognize in reading this man's work, Man's Search for Meaning, is that this is a person who for 3 years, from 1942 to 1945, was incarcerated as a Jew, he and his family, in actually 4 different Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And so this was the period in which he was most deeply grappling, perhaps, with the issue of meaning. How can you be in a concentration camp during the Holocaust? How can there be any meaning in that, in terms of all the situations one might find oneself in recorded world history, certainly incarceration in such a death camp would have to be right towards the top in terms of the severity and the intense challenge of even surviving, let alone finding a meaningful life. But he did, and he wrote about it. And as soon as his book came out, it immediately became an international bestseller, Man's Search for Meaning. And so I'll quote just a few short phrases or comments by him. But the first of these being, life is not primarily a quest for pleasure, as Freud believed, and he studied under Freud, or a quest for power, as Alfred Adler taught. Life is primarily a quest for meaning. The greatest task for any person is to find meaning in his or her own life. And this is something over which we can exert, in fact, a lot of control. So many things in the surrounding environment, how other people treat us, the circumstances we encounter, and so forth, are beyond our control. The pandemic is beyond our control. Right today, we're having the hottest day of the year in Santa Barbara, intense heat wave. It's only about 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Santa Barbara, right on the coast. Other places in California, 120. So very oppressive, probably life-threatening for some people. And so meaning, especially in the face of adversity, how can we cultivate and sustain? We don't look outside for meaning. Either we bring meaning to our lives or there is no meaning, but it's not something we pursue. So let's turn to the next slide as he continues to share his wisdom with us. So I get that next slide, please. So he gives us advice here. Don't aim at success. I need to move something I can read. Don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It's not something out there that you run after it and then acquire it. It must ensue. And it only does so as the unattended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. So I think he's really hit some extremely important points here. And these for all of us to attend to, I think at any occasion, because there are always adversities of some kind taking place around the world in our lives, the lives of our loved ones. And now we have something that's global. How can we find meaning? How can we bring meaning to this challenge of the pandemic and all the constraints that it entails? Can we take this as an opportunity, as he did in Auschwitz? And I wonder if there's anybody living now, facing all the adversities, all the challenges of the pandemic, that face something as dire, as catastrophically traumatic, and filled with so much grief in the loss of his father and other family members who died in the concentration camps in which he also was incarcerated. If we can learn from him, if we can face anything even approximating the adversity that he did, then he will have served us in a very, very meaningful way. So let's turn to the next slide. To be sure, man's search for meaning may arouse inner tension rather than inner equilibrium. He's implying here, I think, that the search for meaning is not necessarily easy and smooth. that it will go flawlessly and there will be no tension, it might actually arouse tension freshly, where there was not such tension before. However, precisely such tension, he writes, is an indispensable prerequisite of mental health. So the ideal of living with no tension is the ideal of living with complete anesthesia. That's not the way life is, and it's not the way we grow and mature in compassion or in wisdom. And so such tension, he says, is an indispensable prerequisite of mental health. There is nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as and again, I need to shift something here, as the knowledge that there is meaning in one's life. So I have to say, I fully agree with him. The knowledge that there is meaning in one's life. And the greater that sense of meaning, I would suggest, based somewhat on my own experience, the greater resilience we will embody and express during times of minor adversity and even the most intense adversity. So this raises the question then, how can we cultivate and deepen a sense of meaning in our lives that we know to be there, not from outside, it's very internal, it's subjective, it's immaterial, it's qualitative. How can we cultivate meaning? So let's turn to this as we go to the next slide. Meaning. Where do we find meaning? Where is meaning to be found? And for many religious people, specifically theists, such as Jews and Christians and Muslims, Hindus as well, who believe that the entire universe was created by a benign and loving, compassionate creator, a divine creator, who, as we read in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible, created the whole of the universe and said upon its conclusion on the sixth day, it is good, it is good. Then, as a theist, one might very reasonably, I think correctly, within that context, believe that meaning is to be found out there, independent of us. That God created the universe according to his own designs, and he would certainly create a meaningful universe and not a meaningless universe. And so we so often hear theists, Christians and others, saying when something occurs because of natural causes, sometimes called acts of God, whether it's local, whether it's a tragedy in your own family, or whether it's a pandemic or some other natural catastrophe, or whatever may happen, many theists will look upon this with deep faith, deep reverence, and a sense of ongoing gratitude to their creator, with a sense that this must be God's will, there must be meaning in this, and let us accept this as meaningful and make the best of it, because it was something presented by a divine source, and it must be already meaningful. And it's for us then to discover what that meaning is and try to benefit from it. So I respect that. That's a view of many, many theists, that the universe is already meaningful, and what happens to us in our daily lives, there is a design, there's an intention, there is a loving plan behind whatever occurs. So many, many religious people accept that belief, and they take great comfort in that belief. I respect that. A scientific perspective, and we see this expressed by, for example, the biologist Stephen Jay Gould, a division, he called them the non-overlapping magisteria. And what is out there objectively is simply reality. And science discovers many facts, many truths about the objective world, the natural world. But it's not meaningful, it's just, that's what's happening. Natural phenomena arising in accordance with, operating in accordance with laws of physics, chemistry, biology. That there's no objective meaning out there, no objective meaning in the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. It's just what's happening. So if there's to be meaning in our lives, and scientists and people who are materialists and agnostic, all kinds of people do want meaning. But for the person who is not a theist and is perhaps a materialist, believing that science alone is revealing the nature of reality, telling us what's objectively out there, and it's a world, a physical world composed of matter and energy, space and time. There's no meaning to be discovered out there. So if there's to be any meaning in our lives, it has to be what we create, what we imagine. We have to define meaning. What is a meaningful life? We have to define it ourselves and try to lead a subjectively meaningful life in an objectively meaningless world. So a clear break, as Stephen Jay Gould very famously argued, that we have the world of facts, and that's objective, and we have the world of values and meaning, and that's subjective, and these are non-overlapping. So some people find that meaningful and helpful. But then meaning, of course, is entirely subjective. It's relative, it's subjective. You make it up as you go, but don't expect that necessarily anyone will agree with you, because it's just what you've conjured up. I'd like to introduce here a third perspective, which can be very religious in its spirit, in its ambience, but it may be, I know from my own experience, very scientific in the sense of rigorous, experiential, rational, motivated by a deep spirit of inquiry, a contemplative perspective. And the contemplative perspective, and I speak especially from Buddhism, according to this perspective, meaning is found not just objectively, as if something already given, inherently existent out there, and not purely relative, purely subjective, something we simply make up. Not that either. But meaning is to be found in the interrelations between individuals and the world. And the deepest source of meaning, I'm speaking now especially in terms of Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Dzogchen, great perfection to which I've been really focusing my studies, my practice, teaching and writing for the last 30 years in particular, is that meaning ultimately stems not simply from the way we interact with the world, but from an ultimate and transcendent ground of being, in which pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, is very salient, a wellspring of genuine well-being, a wellspring of virtue, an ultimate and transcendent wellspring of meaning. And on this phenomenal level, this world of conditioned reality, then meaning emerges from the way we interact with other people, animals, the ecosphere at large. So it's not just something made up, and it's not simply something discovered, but it's something that arises in this interdependence between I and thou, subject and object. It's very real, but it's something of a middle way. Let's turn to the next slide. It's nice to have a bit of a pause. So, a spectrum of meaning. I want to emphasize that no one, of course not I, but no one else either, has a monopoly on the meaning of meaning. It has different meanings, different definitions according to different contexts. And it all depends on what we are attending to. So physicists, what's the focus of their study? What are they professionally paid to investigate? The objective physical world that can be quantified, for which the laws can be discovered, and a domain of reality in which countless marvelous discoveries have been made. And what are physicists attending to? The behavior of inorganic configurations of mass energy. And when for example, a planet is orbiting around the sun, or a gravitational field is being generated by some mass, or two particles interact, and so on, inorganic configurations of matter and energy. Physicists will study the patterns, the regularities of their interactions, and thereby discover what we call the laws of physics. What the laws are, well, this term came out of a theistic setting where God imposed the laws of nature upon nature, so they're God's own laws. But in this more secular context, a religious context of modern 20th and 21st century science, the notion of law doesn't really pertain. It doesn't seem to be quite so relevant, because laws are something that someone, something, a government, a god, a governor imposes upon the world, a state, a nation, and so on. These are regularities. That's what they are. And these regularities of the movements of atoms, particles, fields, waves, and so forth, they have no purpose. They have no purpose. There's no meaning. They are just responding mindlessly and meaninglessly to other phenomena within the natural world. So much for inorganic, and that would be for physicists and chemists. But then we turn to zoologists, those who are studying conscious life forms, animals, even down to insects, reptiles, amphibians, warm-blooded animals. And we know animals, which experience pleasure and pain, procreate, try to survive. Zoologists attend to the purposeful behavior of conscious organisms, and following the lead of Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, the prime directive for animals is to survive and procreate. So animals move about in order to survive and procreate. And so when they're moving, they're not moving for no reason, for no purpose. They are moving in order to get food, to procreate, to survive. And so that is purposeful. But then one can ask, is there meaning in merely surviving and procreating? Well, it's probably not a question that animals ask very much, maybe never. But then psychologists studying human beings attend to the meaningful behavior of human beings as social animals. We are told many, many times that we are animals, we are primates, we have our nearest kin with the chimpanzees, gorillas, and so forth, and we engage in meaningful behavior, purposeful, but also meaningful, because in our interrelationship with each other and the natural environment, we are seeking constantly to avoid pain, discomfort, fear, grief, and to find happiness, pleasure, joy. So it's meaningful insofar as we can avoid pain, suffering, grief, and find joy. And many people find that meaningful, to find joy. But then I turn to, and you see I'm coming to what I regard as the culmination here. There's something of a hierarchy here. And contemplatives attend to the meaningful behavior of cultivating an ethical way of life. Contemplatives, whether they're Taoist or Hindu or Buddhist or Jaina, all great contemplative traditions, embedded in all of the great religious traditions of the world, they're all rooted in ethics. There isn't a single contemplative tradition or religion that doesn't have ethics as its foundation. Now, to be sure, the ethical norms, the regulations, the laws, and so forth differ from one religion to another. But I think there's a lot of common ground if we keep it simple. And I'm pointing to the very core of ethics in the Buddhist tradition, which is drawing on centuries and centuries of contemplative practice prior to the Buddha, where ethics fundamentally means, first of all, abiding to the principle of nonviolence. At least don't harm, not with your thoughts, not with your speech, and not with your physical deeds. And then whenever you have the opportunity, then act with benevolence, serve your fellow creatures, be of benefit. And so contemplatives attend to the meaningful behavior of cultivating an ethical way of life, first of all, and that's something that every religious person, hopefully every person on the planet, values, because if we don't have ethics, if we don't treat each other and the environment in a nonviolent and benevolent way, then there's no reason to call ourselves members of human civilization. And there's also, without ethics, there's not really any hope for the perpetuation of the human species, let alone human civilization. But on this basis, then contemplatives do something more, and that is with an active cultivation of mental balance, of mental well-being. And of course, I'm drawing explicitly here from Buddhism, but not uniquely so. But the Buddha spoke on the basis of the higher training in ethics. Then there's the higher training of cultivating samadhi. Samadhi is indeed single-pointed attention, but in this context of a higher training, it means really the cultivation of exceptional levels of mental balance, mental health, cultivating meaningful aspirations, benevolent aspirations, altruistic aspirations, our ideals, our aspirations, what I've called the conative, that's what psychologists call it, the cultivation of the attention, the development of samadhi, that is certainly crucial. On that basis, cultivating discerning mindfulness, not just in meditation, but throughout the course of our daily lives, and especially the mindfulness in which we are intelligently and discerningly aware, especially of our own conduct. What is wholesome? What is conducive to our own and others' genuine well-being? I would pretty much define virtue in that way. Any deed of body, speech, and mind that supports, nurtures, and sustains our own and others' genuine well-being. How can that not be virtuous? And any type of action of body, speech, and mind that undermines, destroys, diminishes our own and or others' genuine well-being. I would say that is a pretty good definition within the context of this life, without necessarily believing in reincarnation or karma in this life. Any type of activity that we engage in that really erodes or even destroys our own and or others' genuine well-being can hardly be regarded as a virtue. It can't be. But it's clearly something harmful, detrimental, unwholesome, or we can simply say non-virtuous. And then on that basis, then the cultivation of wisdom. This is the classic Buddhist teaching, the basic structure of Buddhist practice altogether. Ethics, samadhi, and wisdom. And wisdom not simply in terms of acquiring more knowledge about the world at large, more information driven but simply by curiosity, not to diminish any of the discoveries made with the motivation of curiosity, which does drive a lot of scientific research, but in contemplative inquiry. And I'll speak especially of the one tradition I know best, the Buddhist tradition. We are seeking to fathom the nature of reality, but not out of sheer curiosity, not for the sake of simply enhancing our hedonic well-being, bolstering our immune system, finding greater pleasure, greater enjoyment, longevity, greater health, and so on. There's nothing trivial about those, but that's not a fundamental motivation for engaging in contemplative inquiry, to fathom the very nature of ourselves, the nature of the mind, the role of mind in nature, to understand the fabric of reality, especially as it pertains to finding the freedom from suffering, the irreversible and complete freedom from suffering that we've always been wanting, and finding a sustainable and utterly fulfilling and satisfying sense of well-being that's not simply contingent upon going from one episode of good fortune to another, which is, of course, not sustainable. And so that's the framework for contemplative practice. And it's within that framework of ethics, cultivating exceptional mental balance, unification of one's psyche, one's personality, and cultivating wisdom that one finds meaning. So let's turn to the next slide. And we turn to a very simple question. And again, there's no right answer here. There's no one right answer any more than there's one right answer. What constitutes a meaningful life? But what is it about us that makes us distinctively human? So we know in modern biology, ever since Darwin, we are really regarded as we are animals. We share a lot in common with other higher primates. So we are primates, they're a form of animal, of mammals, and mammals are warm-blooded together with birds and so on. And so we're simply regarded by many contemporary philosophers and scientists, we are animals. We are animals. Well, okay, it's a matter of definition. I won't argue it. But we're unusual animals, exceptionally unusual animals. And so let's look at some of the exceptional qualities of simply being a human being. That is, we human beings have the ability to distinguish between hedonic pleasure and genuine happiness or genuine well-being. Hedonic pleasure being any type of pleasure, happiness, or joy that comes in response to something nice happening to us. Sensual, or the pleasure we get from really work that we find satisfying, the pleasure of having a happy and healthy, harmonious family, sensual pleasures, aesthetic pleasures, intellectual pleasures, all kinds of pleasures that are arising in response to a pleasurable stimulus. That's hedonia. But we as human beings, and I'm not sure that any animals have this ability, I don't see any evidence for it, we have the ability to distinguish, to understand, and cultivate genuine happiness, genuine well-being. And as I said repeatedly already, this is not something we get from the world, this is something we bring to the world and can even be brought to situations of great adversity. It's up to us. It's not something delivered to us. So we human beings have a unique capacity to cultivate genuine happiness. And how? Well, I've already laid out the contemplative strategy by leading an ethical way of life, by developing exceptional mental health and balance, and by cultivating wisdom. Those three right there are the key to actively cultivating genuine well-being or happiness. And this may be a unique quality of human beings, at least among the sentient beings that are visible to us on this planet right now. Something distinctively human. So might a person lead a whole life from birth to death and never get around to even being introduced to the distinction between hedonia and eudaimonia, mundane pleasures and genuine well-being, and never spend any time at all cultivating the inner causes of genuine well-being. I think that's certainly possible. But what that implies to me, though, is an extraordinary opportunity missed, because we human beings have the capacity to do that, perhaps unlike any other creature on the planet. And if we fail to take advantage of that, it strikes me like as a great loss. We human beings have the ability to gain insight into fundamental aspects of reality and thereby dispel the fundamental causes of suffering, and most specifically, ignorance. So there's a point that I've been reflecting on for a long time, having studied biology and engaged in many conversations with outstanding biologists, some of them world-class. And I've asked again and again, from a purely evolutionary perspective, why is it that we human beings, biologically speaking, have this very large frontal cortex, far, far beyond anything we need in terms of just the sheer biological basis for human intelligence, far beyond anything we need for mere survival and procreation. Why do we have so much independence upon this brain? Why do we have so much intelligence, imagination, memory, logic, language skills? Because the principles of natural selection are parsimonious. You get what you need to survive and procreate, and that's it. You don't get more. So why do we have so much more, orders of magnitude, what, 100, maybe 1,000 times more intelligence, imagination, creativity, memory, language skills, the ability to learn from people who lived and died 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, and to learn from people around the world who wrote in dozens, even hundreds of different languages that we have the ability to learn from generation to generation. How did this happen? How do you explain that in terms of just the mindless processes of natural selection and genetic mutation? And I've never heard a satisfying answer. I don't think there is a biological explanation for it, but here we are with this intelligence. This ability to use, perhaps all we need maybe is 5% of our intelligence to just survive and procreate. Okay, we're animals. We do want to survive and procreate. What about the other 95%, the other 99%? What do we do with all that excess intelligence? just have more pleasures, more wealth, more power, more prestige, which animals can have too, after all, and they do it, and with the same motivation? Or can we use this intelligence to cultivate and achieve something that no other species appears to have the ability to do? So in order to draw from our full potential as humans, we are here to use our faculty of reason, our exceptional abilities of clear, sharp logic and reasoning, and perhaps above all, our abilities of speaking and understanding language, both spoken language as well as now for a few thousand years, written language. And clearly no other species that we know of on this planet have that ability. So if we are to be fully human, we'll take full advantage of that which makes us distinctively human, and thereby cultivate levels of meaning that perhaps no other creature on the planet is able of realizing. So let's turn to the next slide. So I have to refer to this because materialism is, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, materialism, often coming with the adjective scientific materialism, is a very, very dominant paradigm in our world today. It arose out of Europe and spread quickly to America. And now, as through the 20th century and into the 21st century, scientific materialism has really become dominant in many societies, nations around the world. It dominates modern education to a very large extent. It dominates academia from kindergarten right on through to postdoctoral work. It dominates scientific inquiry. It dominates the media. They hardly ever question it, the popular media. And it dominates also government policy for many countries such as the United States and Europe and Russia and India and China in terms of the allocation of funds for scientific research. The vast majority of the funds go to research that's conducted within the paradigm of materialism. And what is materialism? It's not science. The belief that the whole of reality consists of simply configurations of matter and energy taking place within space-time, configurations of matter and energy and their emergent properties, and that's all there is to reality. That is a metaphysical view. It's a belief. It's an assumption. It is not a scientific conclusion, but it easily stems from the belief that only scientific inquiry, as we know it now, which focuses on the objective, the physical, and the quantifiable, only scientific research actually sheds light on the nature of reality. And if that's true, then materialism flows from that belief, not from scientific evidence, because if you believe that only science tells us anything about reality, objective reality, and the only realities science is capable of revealing are physical realities, then you draw the conclusion, okay, the universe reality consists only of the physical. Well, once again, that's not a scientific conclusion, that's a metaphysical belief, but it is advocated by very many prominent scientists ever since the time of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. When scientific materialism started to really surge and dominate scientific teaching and research and publications, and Richard Feynman, the great Nobel laureate, physicist at Caltech, he sums this up as a physicist who is a materialist when he says that there is nothing that living beings do that cannot be understood from the point of view that they are made of atoms acting according to the laws of physics. So human beings then are simply bodies consisting of atoms that are moving, acting about within fields and so forth, and everything we do can be understood in terms of atom. In other words, complete absolute reductionism, and that's all there is to human life. Well, of course, these movements of atoms are purposeless and meaningless. I don't think any physicist would refute that. And so where do we fit into the universe at large, we who are just conglomerations of atoms, waves and fields, particles, and so forth? Well, another brilliant physicist, the late Stephen Hawking, comments on the existence of human race in the universe. And he said the human race is just chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. So if you like to feel really small, think of yourself as that you're just a tiny, tiny particle, one out of 7.8 billion particles of human organisms around the planet. And you are chemical scum on an insignificant planet, an insignificant solar system, an insignificant galaxy, one out of 100 billion. And I guess he believed that. But as with a comment by Richard Feynman, this is not a scientific conclusion. This is a metaphysical belief. And once again, if you think science is the only way to understand human existence, then you can easily come to that conclusion. But then we turn to the biologists who I've mentioned before, Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, a very eminent evolutionary biologist. And he comments on this object of his life's work, natural selection, evolution. And he says in a phrase, evolution is purposeless, non-progressive, and materialistic. And if it's without purpose, it's certainly without meaning. And after all, if all there is to human existence, like earthworms and cockroaches and alligators, if all there is to human existence that's real, that dominates our movements and our behavior, is simply survival and procreation, well, I would agree with him. That's not meaningful. Just to survive a while and procreate and then dump this on the next generation. I've just led my meaningless, purposeless life, and now I've made more of you, so you do the same. It's pretty bleak. Well, if people want to embrace a bleak, barren, arid, meaningless worldview and think that human beings are solely products of natural selection and genetic mutation, you're free to believe that. But once again, I think it's profoundly, catastrophically misleading for scientists to say this as if they speak with scientific authority. No, it's not true. That is not a scientific statement. That is an expression of a fundamental, unquestioning allegiance to the metaphysical dogma of materialism. Do scientists know whether there are any non-physical influences in the course of evolution, in the course of a human being's life? Do they know whether any non-physical influences on our thoughts, our emotions, our ideals, our behavior? They don't know because scientists can't measure those. So the notion that our way is the only way, well, immediately, to my mind, is reminiscent of religious fundamentalism. We have the only path. We have the only way. Our doctrine's the only way, and all the other ones are rubbish. You have nothing to learn from them. The only way. And frankly, materialists, whether they're scientific materialists or philosophical materialists or any kind of materialist, they're expressing the same type of I have the only way mentality, which from the time I was a youth, I just found that, number one, ridiculous, but also quite repugnant and unrealistic. When many, many people holding different worldviews, following different methods of inquiry into understanding reality, say, I have the only way, I have the only way. And it's a chorus of people saying, I have the only way. They kind of sound foolish. And I think this view is foolish and wrong, but it's also catastrophic. Let's go to a little bit more, if you can stand it. The next slide. The neurologists. Now we're getting up close and personal. Human brains, human existence. A very noted, very fine neurologist by the name of Antonio Damasio. He writes as a very committed, orthodox materialist. He writes, and I quote, or he stated this in a conference for which I was serving as interpreter for the Dalai Lama. He said, we human beings, we are generally taking the person as a whole, a brain and a body. So that's a person as a whole. You are, I am, in his view, a brain and a body. That's the whole person. And we can use the metaphor that human beings are brains that have a body on their backs. So I've read this many, many times now by neuroscientists especially, that human beings are brains. People, even in the field of neurology, even in the field of mental health, saying, and eminent people, saying that the brain is the agent. The brain is that which thinks and acts and does everything that we do, composes music and makes scientific discoveries. And the brain is the agent, and the mind is what the brain does. The mind is nothing more than what the brain does. So if you want to understand the mind and human nature, look no further than the brain. And their marketing has been spectacularly successful. Many people are believing this, even when it comes to mental health, and saying all mental disease is nothing more than brain dysfunction. And this has been the accepted, unquestioned belief of many people in the mental health care profession. And if that were true, of course, then with the exponential growth of knowledge of the brain and the exponential increase of psychopharmaceutical drugs, one would expect over the last 50 years, a plethora of drugs that would be curing one mental disease after another, since after all, mental disease is simply brain dysfunction, and you can fix those with the appropriate drug. But the reality is, and I've not seen this stated bluntly in any of the popular media, let alone in scientific journals, there is not one psychopharmaceutical drug that cures even one mental disease, which any reasonable person points to the fact that mental disease is something more than brain dysfunction. It should be obvious to everyone, because that's where the evidence points to, but the marketing, the propaganda of materialism is catastrophically effective. And so many people are just given drugs to dull the pain of depression, anxiety, ADHD, PTSD, and so forth. And the final one, if you can take just one more quote, I find this extremely fatiguing even to think along these lines, but the philosopher Daniel Dennett is one of the preeminent voices in philosophy of mind, very influential. Many scientists and philosophers and lay people admire his work, no end. And he says, a human being is nothing more than, again, the nothing more than is immediate giveaway. And I quote, you and I are nothing more than an assemblage of roughly 100 trillion cells, each of which is a mindless mechanism, a largely autonomous micro-robot. And what are these micro-robots? And then the conglomeration of all these micro-robots, how do they function? Well, in accordance with the laws of physics and chemistry, which are mindless and amoral, which means, of course, human beings are amoral biological organisms, not influenced by anything non-physical. So anybody who believes this, and there are many millions, probably billions of people who do, will think that this is somehow scientific. And I believe people should be able to believe whatever they like, and they can articulate any views they like. But it is fraudulent to suggest that any of these statements, starting from Feynman and going on to Dennett, to give any pretense, any suggestion that this is a scientific conclusion based on empirical, compelling fact, because they're not. This is the creed, the dogma that dominates most of scientific research, and it is stifling us and snuffing the light out of the cultivation of meaningful life. So I think this is baggage. This is like a destructive parasite on the living organisms of science, which evolves and grows and mutates and evolves. And materialism, to my mind, is just a parasite, sucking the lifeblood, all meaning out of life, out of the universe. And I hope that parasite meets a natural death very soon, because it is only destructive. While science has many benefits, and a dark side as well, but materialism is just a moral and intellectual straitjacket. So let's move on to new horizons and outgrow this meaningless world. And so lo and behold, in terms of seeking meaning, we can actually look to the most mature of sciences. And I will be brief here because there's a lot of material to cover in only about 15 minutes. So moving on, and I'm going to touch this very lightly, but I've addressed this in detail, for example, in my book, Hidden Dimensions, and my book, Fathoming the Mind. But one of the great theoretical physicists of the 20th century, John Archibald Wheeler, who was a professor of physics at Princeton, he wrote that for a measurement to take place in the context of quantum mechanics, which he presented as quantum cosmology, a true observation of the physical world must impart meaningful information. When you make a measurement, what you're actually getting is meaningful information, and is meaningful to you, signifying a transition from a realm of mindless stuff, the world of stuff out there, to the realm of knowledge. And rather than thinking of the universe as matter in motion, one may regard it as information being processed. But information, meaningful information, is processed only by conscious individuals. And this requires the existence of an observer who processes such information from which the construct of matter is conceived. I don't have time to elaborate here, but he's saying scientists, most fundamentally, directly, are acquiring meaningful information from their measurements, and it's meaningful only because they are conscious observers. Without conscious observers, there's no meaningful information. Without meaningful information, we know nothing whatsoever about the universe. And all these constructs of matter, particles, waves, fields, space, time, are all constructs created by the conceptual mind based upon meaningful information. And meaningful information is not physical. It's not objective, it's not quantifiable, you can't measure it physically. So again, a brilliant theory that he formulated, which I don't have time to elaborate on. I'll just drop this out as a little note to be investigated if you're interested. He speaks of a strange loop in which the physical world gives rise to observers through the process of evolution. The planet's about 5 billion years old. Life may be 3 billion years old. Human species about 200,000 years old. And out of this universe came observers. But then it's observers making measurements that provide meaningful information that we then construct based on our measurements, our own history. And John Archibald Wheeler and even Stephen Hawking and other eminent scientists have come to the conclusion that in fact there is no one true history of the universe. There are multiple histories based upon multiple systems of measurement, which may be incompatible. So the histories are true relative to a system of measurement, which is relative to consciousness. And no consciousness, no universe. So suddenly, we are one heck of a lot more than chemical scum, or mindless robots, or just movements of atoms, when after all, the very category of atom was created by conscious beings. And so the scientists are showing this a way to rediscover meaningfulness and meaning in the universe. Let's go to the next slide. There's a bit more here. Christopher Fuchs, I think, is doing the most cutting edge, interesting, fascinating, groundbreaking work in modern quantum mechanics. I'll just read it. Schrödinger, the great Schrödinger, one of the pioneers of modern quantum mechanics, thought that the Greeks had a kind of hold over us. They saw that the only way to make progress and thinking about the world was to talk about it without the knowing subject in it. In other words, they took consciousness out and subjective human beings out, and they said, now we'll just study it completely objectively. But Cubism, which is his interpretation of quantum mechanics, goes against that strain by saying that quantum mechanics is not about how the world is without us, objectively real from some God's eye perspective, but perhaps, but instead, the world is precisely about, that is quantum mechanics, is precisely about us in the world, and the subject matter of the theory is not the world or us, but us within the world, the interface between the two. And that's how the world emerges in the interface between subject and object. And that's once again where you find meaning. So we move on to the next and final slide, coming to a very renowned medical doctor who's doing very innovative work that is non-reductionistic, non-materialistic in understanding mental health and mental disease, Wayne B. Jonas, and he makes this comment: we define the meaning response as the physiologic or psychological effects of meaning in the origins of treatment of illness, meaning responses elicited after the use of, and I have to move my little cursor here, after the use of inert or sham treatment can be called the placebo effect when they are desirable, and the nocebo effect when they are undesirable. So he's exploring here the placebo effect. How is it that one can simply think or imagine or hope or believe that a certain inert substance that has no medical qualities at all can actually turn out to benefit you physiologically in measurable ways? And it's a meaning response. It's because you believe subjectively that inert substance, because you're imbuing this taking of the substance with meaning, that it actually brings about measurable effects. for the better or the nocebo effect. When you start thinking, I have a disease, you try to diagnose yourself by the internet, and you give yourself some of the symptoms of a disease you don't have because you are imputing this meaning response on things that have nothing to do with illness at all or good health. So meaning is coming back by way of science, but it's always been here outside of science. Let's go to the next slide. How to cultivate a meaningful life? Well, I don't pretend in any way to say, here's the right answer, but the answer or response that I'm giving, I have found very meaningful and practical in my own life as I myself try to lead a meaningful life and know whether or not I'm leading a meaningful life and what are the criteria by which I come to that conclusion. Insofar as a life is oriented to and prioritizes the cultivation of genuine well-being, ethics, cultivation of mental balance, cultivation of wisdom, it's meaningful. Insofar as we human beings with the capacity not only to enact virtue, but to cultivate virtue, to that extent, this is a meaningful life. And again, highlighting once again this exceptional intelligence, imagination, language skills, the cultivation of understanding insofar as we prioritize in our lives, understanding ourselves, others, the meaning of life, the nature of the mind, the nature of the existence at large, then to my mind, these three factors are good benchmarks, criteria for evaluating the extent to which this life is meaningful. I'm simply suggesting that it's like a shoe, try it on, walk around in it and see whether it fits. I would say it's possible to lead a meaningless life, just to eat a lot of food and procreate and survive and then die with no glimmer of cultivation of genuine well-being, no aspiration to cultivate virtue, and no aspiration to cultivate any understanding that's not completely utilitarian in its nature. It is possible to lead a meaningless life, and that will definitely detract or undermine mental resilience, especially in times of adversity. Next slide, please. Two kinds of happiness. I've commented on this so many times, I can be very brief here. Hedonic pleasure, it comes from the pursuit of pleasant stimuli, the avoidance of unpleasant stimuli. It's analogous anthropologically to the hunter-gatherer phase of civilization. The notion that you have no sources of well-being within, so go outside and try to get something and hold on to it. And all conflict in the world comes from that. It's competitive. If one side has more, another side has less. On the other hand, there's genuine well-being advocated, articulated by great sages throughout history. And it comes, I would suggest, from the integrated pursuit of genuine well-being, the cultivation of virtue, the cultivation of understanding. And you may recall that the word the Buddha used that we translate as meditation, which is bhavana, actually means cultivation. So in terms of the anthropological metaphor, once again, a cultivator phase. Let's move to the next slide. So just briefly, Socrates, again, no tradition has a monopoly on this, but Socrates had a lot of insight to share here when he calls out, you Athenians who are known in excellence, are you not ashamed of yourself to not pursue the virtues of the soul rather than fame, wealth, and reputation? And he says we must treat as most important, not life, but the good life. And the good life, the fine life, and the just life are all the same. And the much later economist, John Stuart Mill, very brilliant man, he comments with a one-liner, I'd rather be a hungry Socrates than a satisfied swine. I think that's self-explanatory. Let's go to the next slide. And so the Buddha had a lot to say about the cultivation of genuine well-being, and I pretty well covered it already, so very briefly. But the Buddha did make this distinction in terms of genuine well-being as opposed to mundane. Genuine well-being comes from a clear conscience because you know you've led an ethical way of life, and from contentment, the cultivation of nonviolence and benevolence. On that basis, the cultivation of psychological well-being through the cultivation of mental balance and unification, or samadhi, and the cultivation of genuine well-being, the highest well-being of freedom, stemming from inside, knowing reality as it is. So it's familiar territory. Let's go to the next slide. This point is very deep, and I find it resonating in many contemplative traditions around the world. It's from the Buddha himself when he says, I know of no other single process which thus developed and cultivated is pliable and workable as is the mind. Monks, the mind which is thus developed and cultivated is pliable and workable. Monks, I know of no other single process so quick to change as is this mind. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, monks, this mind is luminous, but it is obscured by adventitious defilements. Monks, this mind is luminous, but it is free from adventitious defilements. What does this have to do with mental resilience and a meaningful life? He's saying that the afflictions of the mind, such as greed, hostility, egotism, jealousy, and so on, these are defilements of the mind, pollutions, toxins of the mind that obscure a natural and pure luminosity, which is a wellspring of love and kindness and a wellspring of genuine well-being. And insofar as we turn inwards and cultivate that, find meaning inwardly and in our relationship with those around us, mental resilience definitely comes out as an emergent property. To the next slide, please. There's an analogy I've quoted many times for those who know my teachings, but a lovely analogy of a simple practice for cultivating the mind, cultivating the seeds of inner genuine well-being through the practice of mindfulness of breathing. This famous metaphor, I've cited it so many times, it's famous for me anyway. Just as in the last month of the hot season, when a mass of dust and dirt has swirled up and a great rain cloud out of season just before the monsoon disperses it and quells it on the spot, so too concentration or samadhi by mindfulness of breathing, when developed and cultivated, is peaceful, sublime, and ambrosial dwelling, and it disperses and quells on the spot unwholesome states whenever they arise. So he's speaking here of our natural resources, of the mind, of this luminous mind that is always luminous, but on many occasions obscured. And simply by calming the mind, developing mindfulness, introspection, overcoming excitation, rumination, overcoming laxity and dullness, we are tuning, we are refining the mind, and we experience inner peace of mind, the sublime state of genuine well-being and an ambrosial dwelling of bliss arising from the very nature of the mind itself. Therein you will find mental resilience. Turn to the next slide, please. So, Lerep Lingpa, one of the great Dzogchen masters of the late 19th, early 20th century, he comments on a practice I've been teaching now, I think ever since I learned it about 30 years ago, settling the mind in its natural state. I won't quote him here. Many of you have been following the teaching I've been passing on. They're not my teachings. But cultivating the ability to rest in awareness and simply be aware of whatever comes up in the space of the mind, and recognizing mental events as mental events and not identifying with them, not reifying, grasping onto them existing from their own side, but simply being totally present with them with discerning intelligence and letting the mind calm and subside while resting in that awareness. In so doing, as you develop this skill, and it comes with months or years of training, you can come to a point where there's such clarity in your awareness of your activities of your own mind that whatever arises in the mind cannot harm you. It cannot harm you because nothing arising there has any power from its own side. Just like a non-lucid dream, nothing in a non-lucid dream can harm you objectively because there's nothing there objectively. But if you reify the contents of the dream, then you can suffer. And you reify the contents of the mind and the waking state, and you can and you will suffer. But you can by cultivating this quiet, still, relaxed, and luminous awareness, attending to the mind, but without identifying with it. You can become invulnerable, fearless, mental resilience in the face of all kinds of adversity if you find this inner refuge. And so by cultivating this, he said, the afflictions of your own mind stream will be subdued and you will gain the autonomy of not succumbing to them, and your mind will constantly be calm and composed. Mental resilience through cultivating the mind in very meaningful and transformative ways. The path is right here, it's right before us. And this pandemic gives us an opportunity to not spend so much time unnecessarily going outwards like Socrates scolded his fellow Athenians. Maybe it's time to balance out and at least 50-50. going out for hedonia, but coming in to cultivate eudaimonia. Next slide, please. Cultivating a virtuous heart. So I will not read everything here, but many of you are familiar. The four immeasurables, the four divine abidings: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, impartiality. Cultivate these. Expand the field of caring, the field of your awareness, so that you care and more people around you, and not fixated or condensed or contracted just around I, me, mine, or my family, my community. Expand, and you will experience greater meaning and greater resilience. Guaranteed. Big mind, big heart, great mental resilience. Next slide, please. And finally, we have the cultivation of understanding. You recall there was cultivation of genuine well-being, cultivation of virtue. Four immeasurables are universal. Believe whatever you like. Anybody can cultivate loving kindness and so on. And finally, the cultivation of understanding. Well, when we turn outwards scientifically, so much has been learned and to our benefit. It enhances our physical well-being with medicine, with transportation, communication, all the benefits of technology, and the dark side also. But great benefits, hedonic benefits, by looking outwards. We look inward psychologically, understanding the mind, the actual causes of mental distress, and not the brain, understanding the actual causes of genuine well-being, not the brain, and we can experience psychological well-being. And then going deeper to the existential, even the transcendent, understanding ourselves. Who are we really? And our relationship with the world. This is the basis, the foundation, the root for cultivating spiritual well-being, the well-being of freedom. Is there another slide? Let's see. So mental resilience, I think this is the final one, again by another great Dzogchen master, a contemporary of Lerep Lingpa, who I cited before, in his brilliant text, short text, Transforming Felicity and Adversity into the Spiritual Path. That's all about mental resilience. He comments in just this one quote: recognize again and again the pointlessness and the great detriment of all the miserable anxiety you experience through regarding suffering as being purely unfavorable, as it's objectively, inherently, really only unfavorable. You're just tormenting yourself that way. And thoroughly accustom yourself to the powerful anticipation: from now on, whatever kind of suffering arises, I shall not quail, I shall not snap, I shall not break, I shall not shatter. I will be resilient. I will face whatever comes up. And I will do so with discerning mindfulness, with wisdom, with an open heart. And in this way, practice cultivating great courage. So I've just been passing on, I think, great words of wisdom from the East and West, ancient and modern. The keys to mental resilience are in the palm of our hands right now. The way to lead a meaningful life is in the palm of our hands right now. And then it's simply up to us. Will we be fully human? Will we explore the full potentialities of being human and not reduce ourselves, as materialism would have us reduce ourselves to insignificant motions of mindless matter? So that's what I have to offer now. So perhaps there are some questions or comments. I turn to Sangye. What would you like to share?
So we do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So Leah from Australia asks, if a meaningful life is experienced consistently, why perhaps does resilience wax and wane?
It's possible to be leading a meaningful life and they overlook that fact. As Viktor Frankl said, to know that your life is meaningful. Well, that's not just something you do and you remember it and then forget about it. It's every day. Doing our best to lead a meaningful life, cultivate genuine well-being, cultivate virtue, cultivate insight, wisdom, understanding, lead an ethical way of life, and know that you're doing it. And if you know that you're doing it, you may maintain that mental resilience even when you're ill, when there's a pandemic, and there will be more great challenges coming. We know that's for sure. This pandemic will sooner or later subside. There will be other challenges. But if we are leading meaningful lives, and we know we are leading meaningful lives, if it can get Viktor Frankl through Auschwitz and he survived and lived to a ripe old age, I think he lived to the age of 90. If he can do that, then why can't anybody else? Because I think he got about the worst that reality has to dish up as a human being. So that's it. Cultivate a meaningful life and know you are doing so. And that will give you courage, confidence. That will give you resilience, that you have something that nobody can take away from you.
The second question. In the modern capitalistic world, it seems that the greatest motivation is for economic growth, material consumption, and hedonic pleasure, even at the expense of social justice and environmental sustainability. If one is trying to cultivate a life oriented towards eudaimonic, I don't know if that's a spelling mistake, contemplative meaning and environmental sustainability, it can become demoralizing to see the destruction wrought by the capitalist juggernaut. How does one avoid becoming angry or demoralized?
Thank you for an excellent question, very practical question, and I certainly resonate with you. If after this talk is over, you will have the notes that I shared with you, and you will see that among the four immeasurables, the second one is compassion. And the false facsimile of compassion is exactly what you just pointed to. Depression, feeling demoralized, feeling despair, a loss of hope, because you look at the powers that be, governments and big business, idiotically, and I mean literally, idiotically, evaluate society, a business, based on ever-increasing economic growth, as if this is going to turn out well. When governments and businesses get very upset when consumer index goes down, this is idiocy. This is insanity that goes into public policy, government policy, the way businesses are run, and it's just fast pacing. It's the fast track to destroying the entire ecosphere and undermining all of human civilization, very possibly in this century. So there's plenty to be depressed about. But then the natural antidote for this reality-based depression, despair, loss of hope, and feeling demoralized, like what can I as one individual do? Well, the answer is not much as one individual, but we uplift ourselves by turning to another of the four immeasurables, and that's empathetic joy. And if you know where to look, you don't have to look too hard, and you'll find you're not alone. You are not alone. I'm not alone. Buddhists are not alone. Christians are not alone. People who are just ethical people regardless of worldview and trying to save the planet and correct social injustices and this catastrophic inequality of wealth in this modern era, and trying to bring about equality and equal treatment for all people of all ethnicities and skin color and gender and so forth. There's so much good in the world. We are not alone. And so as the forces of materialism are very well integrated, they've got their act together. They have their propaganda machine. They know how to control the media. For people who are seeking a way out of this bottomless swamp of materialism, hedonism, and consumerism that's just undermining human civilization and wiping out the wildlife and natural habitat, we also need to be organized. We need to collaborate. We need to connect people of all different religious faiths and people with no religious faith. Just be ethical, that's enough. Nonviolent, benevolent, and we are brothers in arms, sisters in arms. There's so much good taking place in the world, and we need to focus on it. And as William James, the great psychologist, said, what we attend to is reality. And if we focus on the millions of people around the world, religious and non-religious, scientists, people in humanities, social services, medical people, all kinds of people, recognizing the problem and doing everything they can to solve these problems, to emerge from this quagmire of hedonism and consumerism. When you see you're not alone and you're explicitly connected with all similar people who are simply trying to lead meaningful lives and save this planet for future generations, you see there is hope. As the Dalai Lama commented once, a situation becomes hopeless only in that moment in which you lose hope. So let's make a decision exercise our free will. As Debbie Nima said on the last slide, have courage. Decide to have courage. Decide to have hope. And then act on that out of benevolence, not out of anger, hatred, resentment, superiority, contempt, and so forth. Don't let us contaminate any of our service to the world with these mental addictions, because if we do, we'll be part of the problem and not part of the solution. There is hope. It's to be recognized.
The next question. I wonder if you ever had students who suffered from clinical depression, where they simply couldn't access any sense of meaning in life. And if so, what were the ways you were able to guide them back to a sense of meaning? Or what methods you observed were being able to affect that for them, to bring benefit, I guess?
Thank you. Your questions are so meaningful to me. So I thank you for each of these questions. And this one, my first response is that I have been trained above all in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, a fair amount of Theravada Buddhism for now 50 years. But no part of my training, from my Theravada teachers, from my lamas from all four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, none of them gave me any training in diagnosing and treating mental illness for a person who has acute and extreme depression that's debilitating. That's not a strength of Buddhism, of clinically diagnosing and treating people with severe mental disease. And I don't have that ability. I never thought I have. And so going back, way back to 2007, when we held the Shamatha project, we had two groups of 35 people meditating in a group meditation. I was leading it, part of a scientific study. And I knew back then we really should have one or more clinical psychologists on hand in case people, as they're going deeper meditation, they trigger something. It could really be a psychological episode, maybe recalling trauma from childhood or other significant neuroses. And I knew I do not have the training to treat that, to diagnose or treat. I don't have that ability. So it happened once when I was leading an 8-week retreat years later in Thailand, that when we accept people for 8-week retreats, we ask them, do you have any mental disease? Are you under the care of a psychiatrist? And if people are suffering from a clinically diagnosed mental disease, we don't admit them into the retreat because I don't have the skills, the knowledge, the experience to treat people. I am not a clinical psychologist, let alone a psychiatrist, so we don't admit them. Well, one person really wanted to participate in the retreat, and he came, very young, very fine man, very ethical man, but he'd suffered from clinical depression for years, and just before he came to the retreat, two of his very dear friends committed suicide. And so I recognized as soon as I had the weekly one-on-one interview with him, that this man is really, really suffering. And I knew I did not have the skills, but he'd coming to me, so I offered my best, the best guidance I could, drawing from all the riches of teachings I received over these many, many years. And I have to say in all candor, I was not able to effectively help him. I offered my very best in meditation, counseling, but I don't have those skills. I never thought I did, but now it became very obvious I don't. And so after several weeks, a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks into the retreat, as I recall, he came to me and he said, Alan, I think maybe I should better leave the retreat and seek professional help from a mental health care professional, clinical psychologist, psychiatrist. And he said, this is a wise decision. I've offered my very best, but I don't have the skills, the knowledge, the training, the experience to help you. So I've offered you my best, but you need guidance and maybe medication. I don't discount the value of antidepressants if they can attenuate the symptoms to enable the person to receive very wise talk therapy from a clinical psychologist. They may not be able to receive that if they're completely inundated or overwhelmed by the depression. So there is a value for psychopharmaceutical drugs, I don't doubt that, to suppress the symptoms, but then go to a mental health care professional, a human being with wisdom and compassion, with training, license and experience, and they may be able to help cure you of clinical depression, general anxiety disorder, and so on. So I believe I know where my limits are because I have no training there, but I know many people who do. So ever since then, 2007, every longish retreat, like 8-week retreat I've led, we've always had a clinical psychologist, one or more, available so that they can offer their guidance to people who may find some upheaval of real psychological distress. And then we work together to do our very best to help people. So every system has its limitations. It's one of the limitations of Buddhism. We don't have developmental psychology and we don't have pathological psychology. And thank goodness, this is one of the strengths of modern mental health care. We all work together and then there's hope.
Okay, one more question. Thank you for the wonderful talk. The descriptions of ethics given near the beginning of the talk sounded much like that of secular humanism. Can you provide this thought on the distinction, if there is one, between humanist ethics and the ethics you advocate from the Buddhist perspective? Are they the same?
They're not the same. I am a disciple. I seek to, in a very tiny way, follow in the footsteps of my root Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And at this point, he's written 2 books on secular ethics, recognizing that billions of people on the planet right now have no religious beliefs. So if a religious leader like His Holiness Dalai Lama, whenever he talks about ethics, he entirely couches it within the framework of Buddhism, that's fine and meaningful and powerful for people like myself who are Buddhists and embrace the Buddhist worldview, because I've checked it very carefully and it's where I feel at home. This is the clearest view of reality that I've seen. But there are many people who follow other religions and some billions of people who have no religion at all. And so we try to find His Holiness himself and in many of his teachings, finding common ground, not to reduce Buddhism to secular Buddhism, but rather to find common ground that people of all different worldviews, faiths, religion, non-religion, can accept. And he settles on these 2 points, going back into classical India prior to the Buddha. Ethics has to start in nonviolence. And it's not just a negative, not doing, not engaging in violent deeds, but also doing when we see the possibility to be of service. And out of compassion, out of benevolence, we do our best to serve the world, for which we have received so many benefits. Then we seek to repay the kindness of those around us with acts of benevolence. Because this is core Buddhist ethics, to be sure. Not something he just made up, but it's also something to be totally embraced by agnostics, by humanists, by atheists, by materialists. I don't want to leave anybody out, because we all need to treat each other and the environment and other species ethically, non-violently, and benevolently. And if we don't, then that spells our destruction. Now, when I, as a Buddhist teacher, now for about 44 years, when I'm teaching to people who are either Buddhist or very interested in Buddhism, coming to me for Buddhist teachings, then I present Buddhist ethics within the Buddhist worldview, Buddhist framework, continuity of consciousness from lifetime to lifetime, which I'm completely convinced is simply true and not a Buddhist belief or simply a religious belief. The materialist alternatives just do not withstand scrutiny. They're just speculation based on blind faith that, well, after all, everything must be boiling down to matter. So when teaching Buddhists or people interested in Buddhism, I'm very happy. I feel so at ease. Then I can, spread my wings and teach ethics within the rich context of reincarnation, of karma, 10 non-virtues, context of mental afflictions, and the consequences of our deeds from lifetime to lifetime. And the whole theme of ethics takes on such greater gravitas, depth, profundity, when we see that we are in fact creating our future in future lives based upon our actions in this life, or better and worse. So it's very, very powerful. But it embraces the theme I mentioned already. Ethical behavior is conducive to our own and others' genuine well-being, and unethical behavior erodes our own and others' genuine well-being. But for that to mean something, one has to have a clear understanding of what is genuine well-being. It's not just words. Can you see what it actually means? Can you experience genuine well-being? Can you witness other people experiencing genuine well-being? and how certain types of behavior erode or may damage that. So the Buddha himself taught differently depending on who he was speaking to. The Dalai Lama, wisely and compassionately, speaks differently when he's speaking to his fellow Tibetans and they're living in a Buddhist worldview. Whereas in contrast to his speaking with Hindus or Christians or scientists, he's not two-faced or multiple-faced, he's simply using skillful means to offer wisdom and guidance for people within the context of their own worldview, without having an underlying agenda of trying to convert others to a Buddhist worldview. Never been interested in that, and nor am I. I'm not here to convert people to Buddhism. The Bodhisattva ideal is to be of service to all sentient beings, and that's regardless of their worldview and regardless of how ethical or unethical their behavior there is. We're not here just to help ethical people, but especially people whose minds are heavily dominated by mental afflictions and whose behavior in many ways is very harmful. Those are the people in greatest and most urgent need of learning Dharma and freeing themselves of the inner causes of suffering. So, teach secular ethics in a broad context with people with multiple worldviews. Teach Buddhist ethics when people want to learn about Buddhism. So that's my response. And if you'd like to see more, I would encourage you to read these two books. You can easily find them. Ethics for New Millennium. And the other one, I think, isn't it called Beyond Religion, perhaps? I think that's the second one. But he believes in this so passionately. Two books on the same topic. And so I would encourage you to look for greater detail there. So this brings us to about 7:30. So it's been my privilege to share the riches that I've received from both my Western and my Buddhist or Asian education. I know my own life has been tremendously enriched, inexpressively enriched, above all by my Buddhist teachers, but also by very wise professors and teachers I've had, and fellow Dharma brothers, Christians and Jews and so on. So I'm content that for this evening, I've offered you the best I can for the time being. And I hope there's benefit, and I hope these words help you in your own way, by your own lights, cultivate an ever more meaningful life. And by so doing, experience, realize, and embody greater and greater mental resilience, which we all need at all times, but especially in times such as these now, times of adversity. I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We have everybody streaming via YouTube. They would like to thank you for this lecture, and they think that this meaningless materialism in this day and age, they're really glad to have listened to this talk, and we hope everybody enjoyed this talk. We will send you a recording of it, or we will, if you missed some parts of it, we will have the recordings uploaded on our YouTube page. I will share the recordings with you. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you to our team of helpers.
And I prepared the PowerPoint slides, and once I presented them, they're in the public domain, so you can share them with anybody you like, put them on the internet. It's there. It's not my wisdom, so I'm just passing that on, but you're welcome to both recordings of the talk and the PowerPoint slides, which I think really have tremendous wisdom in the words that I've shared with you.
Mm-hmm. So we shall do that. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody, and good morning to everybody in Australia and New Zealand.
A good day to you.
Yes, thank you.